So you have these two totally distinct philosophies about what a luxury car should be, and they're both constantly fighting for the same affluent buyer. On one hand, you have this idea that status is all about sheer size, this maximalist style, the swagger, and on the other, you have a promise of like surgical precision, a dynamic feel, and this sort of quiet technical competence. And this isn't just about engines or leather seats, it's really a profound cultural clash that completely redefined what wealth looked like on the road. Today, we are plunging into a deep dive on how this intense competition between automotive giants really shaped the modern idea of prestige. We're talking about the incredible rise of brands like BMW against the established, unchallenged might of traditional German luxury like Daimler-Benz and, of course, the American kings of chrome, Cadillac.
That is the core tension, absolutely, and that's what we're going to dissect. Our source material today is mostly drawn from the historical and sociological narratives in Engines of Change. And it gives us this amazing cultural history of the automobile. It tracks that deep tension, especially in America, between the promise of personal freedom, that open road dream, and the practical need for utility. And this is the crucial part, it shows how that tension played out in the luxury market. We're going to pull out some key insights on how European dynamism, specifically BMW's incredible decades-long strategic rise, how it both reflected and honestly helped create this massive shift in American taste. A shift away from the big, flashy, fluty Cadillac era and straight into the leaner, performance-obsessed yuppie era.
Exactly. So our mission today is super focused. It's about social history, but told through sheet metal. We want to understand the historical rivalry, the fundamental philosophical clash that created the modern identities of these brands. We're going to use the origin stories of these landmark cars, like the game-changing BMW 3 Series, and we'll put it right up against the classic American luxury land yachts and sort of stuffy German dominance of Mercedes. The goal here is to explain exactly why automotive prestige shifted from pure ostentation, size of status, to sophisticated engineering and dynamic performance. We're really looking for the why behind this revolution. We want to show you how a struggling German company managed to completely redefine global luxury. Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start at the absolute peak of American car culture, the moment it got its most flamboyant, its most unapologetic, and let's be honest, its most kind of hilarious, the American standard, epitomized by General Motors in the long shadow of Harley Earl. This was not an era that cared about subtle engineering. No, this was about spectacle, period. The whole American tradition was focused on two things: visual entertainment and perfecting planned obsolescence. The business model was just elegantly simple. You take last year's mechanics, you slap a flashier, newer skin on it every single year, and you basically force the consumer to constantly upgrade.
And that phrase, visual entertainment, that's the absolute key. It's the lens you have to look through to understand 1950s American luxury. Harley Earl, he was GM's design chief for 31 years. Think about that. From the jazz age to the space age, he was the high priest of this whole philosophy. He genuinely believed, and proved it with sales, that people like visual entertainment. And that wasn't just, an aesthetic choice. It was industrial policy. It drove every single decision coming out of that massive GM tech center.
Yeah, and the source material lays this out so well. It goes all the way back to the beginning. When Earl debuted the LaSalle in 1927, which, by the way, was the same year Henry Ford finally killed the ultra-utilitarian Model T, it was a statement. The LaSalle was explicitly designed to be the first mass-market designer car. Its job was to get attention just as much as it was to get you from point A to point B. It was, the precursor to the modern status sedan long before we even used terms like luxury segment. It was signaling that the car was becoming a piece of personal, conspicuous art.
Right. And if the LaSalle was the beginning of that philosophy, then the most literal, the most visually explosive expression of it was, without a doubt, the Fantastic Era. This was American automotive exuberance perfectly mirroring the high-flying confidence of the country. In the late 50s, Detroit was just locked in this escalating tail fin race. It was mainly between GM and Chrysler. We always think of Cadillac, but you have to remember Chrysler, under their design director Virgil Exner, they really cranked up the outrageousness first.
Oh, they didn't just crank it up, they launched it into orbit. Exner put these enormous fins on his cars and then ran ads with slogans like, "Suddenly it's 1960. And then, my favorite part, he made the completely ludicrous claim that the fins were functional directional stabilizers.
Yeah.
As if a land yacht cruising down Main Street needed the aerodynamics of a fighter jet.
And that, of course, sent a wave of panic through the styling studios at Cadillac. Cadillac saw its position as the ultimate luxury symbol being threatened by the sheer size and audacity coming out of Highland Park. The result was the legendary, the utterly excessive 1959 Cadillac Series 62 convertible. I mean, it's an icon of cultural history. It had the tallest tail fins ever produced. Fins that just seem to reach up and grab your eye from a block away. And don't forget the details. The huge chrome bumpers, the double bullet taillights, and those protruding conical shapes on the front grille, which were famously nicknamed Dagmars after a well-endowed television starlet of the day.
Okay, wait, I have to pause on that. The fact that they named parts of the car's front bumper after a TV pinup model, that tells you everything you need to know about the priorities of the era. It wasn't about quiet refinement. It was about overt sexuality, conspicuous consumption, and this complete sky's-the-limit bravado. The '59 Cadillac, with its Dagmars and its towering fins, it was the ultimate reflection of the space race ethos. It was American exuberance captured in 4 tons of sheet metal. It stood for uninhibited power, both financial and cultural.
Firstly, now let's contrast that. Take that post-war American swagger and financial security and compare it with the state of the traditional German rival. Daimler-Benz and the struggling BMW. The shift in location and philosophy is, well, it's dramatic. Daimler-Benz's identity wasn't about an annual spectacle. It was about established, old-world prestige and engineering excellence. It demanded respect through longevity and proven quality.
Daimler-Benz was just untouchable, a titan. They weren't just Germany's leading automaker. They were its leading and most prestigious company of any kind. They represented this uncontested, dominant hierarchy of German luxury. Their history of engineering excellence went all the way back to the invention of the automobile itself. And that dominance is the essential context for understanding where BMW was coming from.
It absolutely is. You can't understand BMW's eventual success without first grasping how desperate their situation was. And we see this perfectly crystallized by one key historical detail. In 1959, the same year Cadillac was selling those outrageous Series 62s, the mighty Daimler-Benz attempted to absorb the struggling BMW completely. BMW was a financial basket case. They were limping along, surviving mainly on sales of the tiny motorcycle-engined Isetta bubble car, and some big luxury sedans that tried and failed to compete with Mercedes. The fact that the ultimate symbol of German engineering was trying to buy and dismantle them, it just highlights how subordinate and how financially ailing BMW was at that time. They were truly facing extinction.
Which brings us perfectly to the counter-narrative, the creation story of the modern BMW, the philosophy of precision and agility. So bearish Motorenwerk, BMW, was on the ropes financially. The source material paints them as barely surviving this constant precariousness until the crucial intervention of the Quandt family. They needed a strategic genius, or at least a very powerful financial backer, just to survive.
And that salvation came in the form of Herbert Quandt. He was one of 2 half-brothers who, through this dramatic series of financial maneuvers and board meetings, gained control of a majority stake by late 1960. Their commitment wasn't just an investment. It saved BMW from corporate death. It basically turned the company into a private asset of one of Germany's most powerful families. But Herbert Quandt was more than just a money man. He drove the philosophical change. He had a singular vision to return the company to its pre-war roots, not in size, but in character. He wanted technically advanced, small, sporty cars, a fundamental shift away from trying and failing to copy the big luxury model set by Daimler-Benz.
Okay, let's dig into that detail about Herbert Quandt. It's almost mythological. The source says he had severely impaired vision, right? He couldn't fully see the designs, but he was defining the visual and tactile future of the brand.
That's where the legend and the philosophy really intersects. Because his sight was so impaired, the story goes that he evaluated new concept models not by looking at them under bright lights, but by literally rubbing his hands over the prototype shapes and curves to feel their dynamics and their design flow.
Wow.
This emphasized the tactile experience, the driver's connection, and the technical engineering over sheer visual bulk. It was a literal physical rejection of the whole look-at-me philosophy that defined Cadillac. It demanded a connection between driver and machine.
That's profound. It really is. It moved the company away from styling theater and into the realm of engineering integrity. This new focused direction, it culminated in the new A-Class, the new class sedans, starting with the 1500 in 1962. And it was an instant success, critically and financially. It revived their fortunes within just 2 years. And this, of course, led directly to the iconic 2002. These cars were the definitive, permanent shift. They marked BMW's move away from traditional ideas of luxury size, chrome, a floaty ride, and toward performance driving and agility. This laid the entire groundwork for them to conquer the affluent American market a decade later. They realized their path wasn't to challenge Mercedes head-on, but to define an entirely new, smaller, driver-focused segment.
So now we jump forward a decade or so, and we get to see the full effect of this philosophical split. On one side, you still have America and the established German order, so Daimler, still favoring prestige through sheer presence, epitomized by what the source calls the tail-finned land yachts, or the stately, almost regal Mercedes-Benz sedans. The design here was not subtle. It was purely a status signal. It catered to a post-war prosperity where pretension wasn't just tolerated, it was required to show you were successful.
Right, and the psychological profile of that traditional buyer was someone who had made it and wanted everyone to know. They loved post-war consumerism. They demanded the latest model every single year, which was made possible by planned obsolescence. They valued size, the visible expression of wealth, and above all, ostentation. They wanted to show off the size of their success. You felt important just sitting in traffic in one of these dinosaurs.
And you see this deep ingrained attachment in that anecdote from the Cadillac Club of Denmark mentioned in the sources. A member perfectly captured this older romanticized view years after the Finns had died. He dismissed modern, smaller, more efficient cars like BMWs and VWs as merely objects to get you from A to B. And he contrasted them with his beloved dinosaurs, which to him represented a time when the U.S. was the country where dreams come true. So that perspective, it idolizes the car not as a machine, but as a moving symbol, a relic of uninhibited American power. That was the definition of prestige.
But that nostalgia, those heavy aesthetics, they were completely antithetical to the next generation of wealthy buyers. And this brings us to that moment of cultural change, the launch of the BMW 3 Series in 1976. This was, you could argue, the single most perfectly timed corporate move in modern automotive history. Why? Because it arrived just as the first massive wave of baby boomers were hitting their 30s, getting professional success, getting disposable income, and having absolutely zero desire to drive their parents' cars. They were actively looking for a rupture from that past.
And this demographic is the origin of the yuppie, the young urban professional. Their identity wasn't just defined by their new money. It was explicitly defined by their desire for status objects that were different from what their parents had owned. The traditional Cadillacs with their padded vinyl roofs and fake wood trim, they weren't just seen as outdated. They were seen as visually offensive to these new, supposedly sophisticated yuppie sensibilities. The source material captures this so well. It says, the sort of person who bought a BMW would rather be force-fed Velveeta cubes than drive a Cadillac.
It's such a powerful image, that visceral rejection. And it speaks to a shift from inherited status to earned meritocratic status. The Cadillac symbolized old money, or that predictable climb up the corporate ladder. The BMW symbolized the new fast-track success, the MBA, the Wall Street bonus, the tech startup. And crucially, the BMW had to be the right kind of expensive. It was essential that the car's perceived benefits went beyond the comprehension of the hoi polloi. They had to be appreciated knowingly. Only by the cognoscenti, the people who got that engineering detail, was more important than chrome. That's the psychological secret to its success. It became such a defining, almost tribal status symbol for that generation. Just the presence of the car denoted your social standing. The sources capture the satire of the era perfectly, noting that crashing into a BMW was instantly joked about as vehicular yuppie side.
Right.
It wasn't just an accident, it was a cultural event. It reflected the disposable income and the aspirational image that car represented.
And you can actually track this psychological evolution in the design itself. The very first 3 Series, the E21, it was pretty boxy. It had some of that stark utilitarian German styling from the Neue Class. It was conservative. It emphasized the driving experience over flash. But as that yuppie demographic matured and solidified its wealth, the car had to keep pace.
Indeed. The 3 Series couldn't stand still. By the second generation, the E30, which became the definitive icon of the 1980s, and certainly by the third generation, the E36, launched around 1990. The car went through a major styling breakthrough. It adopted these sleek angles and much smoother curves. It was signaling a move toward modern styling while still holding on to that core, sporty, driver-focused heritage. And this stylistic maturation kept pace with its buyers, the dinks, double income, no kids couples who were maximizing their spending power.
And as the dinks inevitably evolved, so did the vehicle. The sources track this. The dinks often later became Orchid's one recent child, hideously in debt trying to maintain that lifestyle.
Right.
Or, in less successful cases, SIT comms, single income, 2 children, oppressive marriage. And the car, the 3 Series, was constantly being updated and evolved, woven right into the fabric of this very specific, affluent American life cycle. It adapted to needing a backseat, but it never sacrificed the driving philosophy.
That constant social mapping is so telling. The car was the single constant thread of their professional and financial ascent. And that status was solidified by the driving mantra BMW adopted for decades. Ultimate driving machine. It's simple, but it's a powerful declaration that this machine is fundamentally about performance and the driver's visceral connection to the road, not just quiet isolation.
And that commitment to sophistication, it filtered right down into the details that served as social filters. Specifically, the model nomenclature. The intricate combination of numbers and letters like the 318i, which meant 3 Series and 1800cc engine fuel injection, or the more powerful 325i's IT, the all-wheel drive wagon, those became status symbols in themselves, understood by what the source beautifully calls the Yupnacenti.
It's true, the system itself was a social gatekeeper. As the source points out, any dodo having bologna on Wonder Bread could confidently say, I drive an Impala. It's a universally understood name. Yeah. But only the person who truly appreciated the texture of truffled risotto and the mechanics of a complex engine could rattle off those alphanumeric combinations with authority. The first number was the model size 3, 5, or 7 series. The next 2 were the engine displacement. Understanding those numbers signaled you were part of the in-group, that you bought the car for its technical merit, not just its badge, even if the badge was, at the end of the day, the main point.
So if we trace this lineage, the rise of BMW, it represents this ultimate comparative storytelling moment in modern consumption history. It represented the journey from bohemians to Bavarians, from hippies to yuppies, and from Beatles to Bimmers for an entire generation of affluent Americans. These were people who, previously drove the countercultural VW Beetle or a microbus in the 60s. Then they found success in the 70s and 80s and needed a vehicle that reflected their new status, but actively, vocally rejected their parents' ostentation.
That connection is absolutely key. One former hippie recalled his transformation. He noted the journey from his microbus exude a subtle whiff of marijuana to becoming a mergers and acquisitions attorney. He traded the vehicular herbicide for Bavarian precision. And that philosophical trait is the essence of the shift. The new affluent buyer wanted to project discipline, technical appreciation, and forward thinking. And the precise, agile, technically complex BMW provided that perfectly, in stark contrast to the soft, predictable, visually excessive American land yacht.
Okay, to really appreciate the success of this BMW philosophy, we need to move beyond just marketing and look at the deep-seated historical difference between European and American driving dynamics. For decades, the American approach to performance was defined by one thing: raw, brute, straight-line power. It was engineered for big, straight streets, endless highways, and drag strips.
And that definition created a very specific kind of car. If you trace the birth of the muscle car era, Americans wanted cars built primarily to go faster and growl louder. The classic example is the original Pontiac GTO, which was essentially fathered by the legendary John DeLorean and engineer Bill Collins back in 1964. The GTO was fundamentally a mid-sized Tempest chassis that had a massive, disproportionate 389 cubic inch engine just shoehorned into it.
And the sheer size of that engine was a strategic defiance of corporate policy, wasn't it? It violated GM's own internal safety rules. They had a mandate, a ratio of no more than 1 cubic inch of engine displacement for every 10 pounds of vehicle weight. The Tempest weighed only about 3,400 pounds, so that 389 engine was almost 50 cubic inches too big, according to the rules. They were literally breaking their own rules to deliver speed.
And yet, they bootlegged the concept through. They sold the engine as an optional package, and the resulting driving sensation was described as electrifying.
Yeah.
This was just pure, unadulterated appeal to speed freaks. It was about breaking rules and pushing limits, embodying the whole rebellious atmosphere of the era. American performance was entirely about the massive engine, like the GTO's optional tri-power setup, which used 3 two-barrel carburetors to maximize horsepower, and, conveniently for Pontiac, to maximize profit. The engineering priority was always acceleration and top speed, often at the expense of cornering stability or, braking ability.
Right. Now, compare that engineering and cultural philosophy to the European tradition, specifically BMW's. It's rooted in Europe's geography of narrow, winding roads and diverse terrain. The focus was always on agility and precise handling above all else. The 3 Series was engineered around this core principle to be highly responsive, balanced, and communicative to the driver.
And this is the battle between sheer mass and dynamic responsiveness. The traditional American luxury sedan, it often had a very soft ride. The steering was heavy with a little road feel, the suspension was designed to just float over imperfections, and you had significant body roll in corners. The goal was isolation and comfort, essentially insulating you from the road experience. The BMW 3 Series, conversely, was engineered for connection.
And that connection, it requires specific technical details. When I say precision, we mean specific engineering choices, right? For decades, BMW championed the 50-50 weight distribution, meaning the weight of the car was distributed equally over the front and rear axles, which is crucial for balanced handling. It allows the car to rotate predictably around corners. They also focused heavily on independent suspension systems and direct steering feedback, often using rack and pinion steering, which was far more immediate and precise than the older systems common in American luxury cars at the time.
Absolutely. The 50-50 balance philosophy is a profound statement about engineering priority. It tells the driver, we care about the entire driving spectrum, acceleration, braking, and turning equally. The philosophy is about leveraging the car's dynamics rather than simply overcoming physics with raw engine power. You can see this contrast even more clearly in high-performance racing, which often informs these design choices.
And that's where the Le Mans story comes in. It's a battle of philosophies played out in the ultimate endurance race. When Henry Ford II tried to be Enzo Ferrari at Le Mans in the mid-60s, Ferrari's long-standing philosophy was that a smaller, more lithe, more agile car like his V12s with around 420 horsepower would outrun the massive, heavier American entries in the corners.
Yeah, like the Ford 427 V8 with 486 horsepower. And that cornering advantage was compounded by efficiency. The heavier, more powerful Ford had to spend more time in the pits refueling. That massive engine was thirsty, and the extra weight was just brutal on the brakes and tires. Ferrari's philosophy was that time saved in the pits and time gained in the twisty bits of the track were more valuable than a few extra miles per hour on the straightaway. The contest was European precision and efficiency against American muscle and maximalism.
So the BMW 3 Series successfully imported that corner-carving, dynamic philosophy into the mainstream luxury road car segment. However, they were always strategically adaptive. They couldn't just ignore the American market's constant craving for high horsepower entirely. As U.S. gas prices stabilized and then fell, the BMW 3 Series gradually eliminated the entry-level four-cylinder engines in America. They started focusing almost entirely on the smoother, more powerful inline six-cylinder engines.
It was a calculated compromise. They added size and power. The cars grew progressively larger and heavier with each generation to meet that consumer demand for muscle. But they did it while carefully preserving that essential sporty feel, that tactile connection to the road. They maintained the 50-50 weight distribution, they kept the crisp steering feel, and they made sure the chassis was stiff enough to deliver agility, even with the added bulk.
That continuous, calculated evolution. Developing a new generation every 6 or 7 years, adding size and horsepower, yet somehow managing to maintain the core sporty feel. That is the foundational reason the brand was able to define the young, affluent consumer and maintain its cultural relevance for decades. It was an agile, engineering-led response to changing tastes without sacrificing the core handling precision that defined the brand's unique status. It offered the sophistication of a race car disguised as a sensible sedan.
But the transition from the muscle car era to the precision driving era wasn't purely philosophical. It was heavily influenced by hard external forces. Specifically, governmental safety regulations and environmental controls. The automobile story often hits a wall when technology and external policy intervene, and the 1970s oil crises and environmental protection acts proved this conclusively.
Exactly. The introduction of clean air laws, particularly the Clean Air Act of 1970, it forced a radical shift in automotive priorities, even for high-performance giants like GM. And the traditional American performance machine was hit the hardest, because their engineers initially struggled desperately to make these high-horsepower, large displacement engines compatible with the mandated low-lead and no-lead gasoline.
And the immediate impact was just catastrophic for Detroit's performance image. The GTO's most powerful engine, for instance, saw this shocking drop in official horsepower ratings. It went from 360 horsepower to 1970 to 310 in 1971, and then just kept plunging as they had to lower the compression ratios. This led directly to a crisis in the performance market and the eventual end of the GTO altogether in 1974.
Detroit's engineering was all geared toward maximizing cheap, leaded fuel power, and when the rules changed, they were just caught flat-footed.
And it wasn't just performance that suffered, it was platform survival. You see this regulatory impact defining who enters and who exits the market. Take the Volkswagen Beetle. It's incredibly successful, durable, but very simple air-cooled engine just could not sustain the tightening U.S. emission standards.
Right.
It led to its eventual withdrawal from the American market. VW was forced to pivot radically, introducing entirely new platforms based on water-cooled front-engine cars like the Dasher and the Golf or the Rabbit in the early 70s.
But BMW and the European mainstream, along with savvy Japanese entrants like Honda, they were simply better positioned. Their engineering was already focused on refinement, efficiency, and advanced fuel delivery systems, like fuel injection. And that was far easier to adapt to tightening emission standards than those brute force carburetor setups. So BMW's focus on advanced engineering allowed them to adapt strategically. They didn't just survive the regulatory shift. They used it as a strategic advantage against both the struggling Detroit muscle car scene and the simple air-cooled European cars like the Beetle.
And beyond environmental controls, the 60s and 70s also birthed the consumer safety movement. This was largely catalyzed by figures like Ralph Nader and the whole controversy around the Chevrolet Corvair, which, because of its unconventional swing-axle rear suspension, was notoriously prone to spinning out around curves under certain conditions.
Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, even though only one chapter focused on the Corvair, it became this sweeping indictment of Detroit's perceived disregard for public safety in the pursuit of styling and cost-cutting. And the legal evolution that followed. You had GM dealing with massive Corvair liability lawsuits. Nader himself was being placed under surveillance by company operatives. It fundamentally altered the relationship between corporations and the public. The new focus on litigation, on mandatory safety standards and crash testing, it meant that cars could no longer rely solely on horsepower and styling to sell. They needed demonstrable engineering integrity, which played perfectly into BMW's established philosophy.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that car choices in these luxury and performance segments were always about identity, not just transportation. And this is where BMW succeeded so brilliantly by defining a new type of modern, meritocratic, engineering-backed prestige that fit the new sociological reality of the affluent class.
Absolutely. The cultural weight of your car choice became heavier than ever. We've established how the older generation viewed the dinosaurs with tail fins as these romantic, bold emblems of a dream. But the BMW buyer, the yuppie, they enjoyed their affluent lifestyle, the dinks and the orchids, and their car was integral to that image.
Yeah.
It provided benefits that, as we noted earlier, were beyond the comprehension of the hoi polloi.
Yeah.
They weren't ostentatious in the Cadillac sense of being visually loud, but they were certainly sophisticatedly pretentious. Their status signal was exclusivity through intellectual appreciation.
And this is where we circle back to the humor in the sources, which often highlights the paradox of this new class. The source draws this funny connection, citing a restaurant review that describes the BMW drivers of the era as BMW cowboys, grazing among the arugula. That phrase, BMW cowboys, is just brilliant.
It is.
It captures the convergence of the newly affluent, the elite, and this slightly rugged yet refined image. They wanted something that signaled they were educated, had taste, and appreciated that mechanical connection, a sophistication that went deeper than sheer chrome and size.
And that anecdote is layered with beautiful irony. The source makes the delightful observation that another older name for arugula is rocket.
Huh, right.
So you have the yuppies who have graduated from the simple Beetle, enjoying the sophistication of the BMW, the ultimate rocket, while simultaneously embracing an image that valued organic, intellectual sophistication over brute force. It's a perfect microcosm of the philosophical shifts in status markers in late 20th century America. The rejection of the industrial age's excessive aesthetics in favor of the meritocratic, connected machine.
So this deep dive has really shown us the two competing blueprints for automotive luxury and success that defined the late 20th century. On one side, we've got the established luxury tradition, the legacy of Harley Earl, Cadillac, and the traditional dominance of Daimler-Benz. It prioritized visual status, sheer size, a soft, isolating ride, and annual styling changes that embraced planned obsolescence. Historically, that tradition offered the throne of style and sheer presence.
And on the other side, you have the BMW path.
It was forged in independence and focused by Herbert Quant's tactile dynamic vision. And that path emphasized dynamic performance, visceral driver connection, engineering precision, the 50-50 balance, the responsive steering, and timely adaptation to regulatory challenges. This strategy successfully captured the imagination of the modern affluent buyer, the yuppie who demanded sophisticated meritocracy over, vulgar ostentation. It offered the crown of the driving experience. The history of these brands is truly the history of evolving cultural and technical priorities. It shows how a philosophy centered on the driver can successfully challenge decades of established, size-focused prestige.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, especially when you think about where we are now. Decades after the 3 Series first conquered that affluent class, in the history of the automobile, you constantly see this pendulum swing violently between the purely utilitarian like the Model T or the Beetle and the purely pretentious, whether that's the tail-finned land yacht of the 50s or the massive, oversized SUVs of today. We've traced the philosophical origins of these European giants from a time when one was struggling to survive against the unquestioned dominance of the other.
And as automotive technology continues its relentless evolution, pushing toward new power sources like electrification and, crucially, toward complete driving autonomy, the core value proposition of the automobile is changing once more. We have to ask, if the car becomes a fully passive, self-driving environment, will the emotional connection and the dynamic precision that so brilliantly define the rise of brands like BMW eventually be rendered obsolete? In the pursuit of the connected, passive, luxurious future, will the sheer luxurious comfort and passive, isolated riding experience, which was the original, uncompromised promise of the great, soft, status cars of the Cadillac and Mercedes S-Class era, will that ultimately reclaim the throne of global prestige?